It is difficult to imagine an entire world vanishing almost at once, yet that is what happened more than 3,000 years ago. In the span of barely a single long human lifetime, cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to blackened shells. Writing systems that had recorded the laws, debts, prayers, and daily errands of countless people simply disappeared from history. International trade networks, the arteries of the age, collapsed so completely that even in our own time, with satellites and sonar, we still struggle to trace where some of these routes once ran. Entire languages went extinct, their last speakers dying without anyone alive who could understand them, and perhaps most unsettling of all, the people living through those final peaceful decades had no idea their world was about to unravel. Welcome to History in Ashes, where we explore not just what happened in the past, but why small, boring, often invisible details shaped the destiny of whole civilizations. Today, we begin our deep journey into the Bronze Age collapse, the moment when the great kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East fell in quick succession, leaving behind ruins, scattered pottery, and a silence that lasted generations. Before we travel deeper, could you do something small for us? If you are watching this, please slip down into the comments and tell us where in the world you are and what time it is there right now. It is strangely comforting to imagine viewers from different corners of the earth gathering here, across time zones, to look back at a past that once believed itself stable. And while you are down there, we kindly and with a touch of desperation ask you to subscribe. Think of it this way. During the Bronze Age, entire kingdoms collapsed when people failed to support the systems holding everything together. And we really hope this channel does not collapse the same way. So please subscribe, let us not become another forgotten empire. Now, let us step back into those final glowing years before the fall. The late Bronze Age, stretching across the lands we now call Greece, Turkey, Syria, Israel, Lebanon, and Egypt, was a world connected by delicate threads. Kings exchanged letters carved into clay, offering their daughters in marriage or requesting shipments of cedar, gold, or lapis lazuli. Merchant ships carried tons of copper and tin, the essential ingredients for bronze, across seas that were busier than many imagine. Palaces hummed with scribes, accountants, priests, diplomats, and administrators, each recording even the smallest detail: grain allocations, livestock inventories, temple offerings, the distribution of labor for repairs on irrigation canals. To us, these records feel dry, even monotonous, but they held an entire world together. In places like Ugarit, a bustling coastal kingdom, the air smelled of the sea, fresh-cut lumber, and the smoke of furnaces used to cast bronze tools. In Mycenae, high walls built from massive stones cast long shadows over storerooms filled with oil, wine, and grain. Egypt maintained its monuments and irrigated its fields along the dependable rhythm of the Nile's flooding. And across Anatolia, the Hittite Empire stretched like a patchwork quilt of tributary states, farmland, fortresses, and roads that carried goods and orders across long distances. In many ways, it was one of the first globalized eras, not in the modern sense, but in spirit. A drought in one land could ripple through another. A shipment delay in a distant port could cause shortages in a royal workshop. A rebellion against a minor governor could disturb a fragile diplomatic balance far away. The world was interconnected, but like most complex systems, far more fragile than it appeared. Behind the palaces, daily life unfolded in quieter rhythms. Farmers tended barley and emmer wheat, measuring their fields carefully since every grain had to be accounted for in palace records. Shepherds moved flocks across hillsides. Artisans hammered bronze weapons and tools, sharpening blades that would be sent to distant garrisons. Potters made storage jars marked with simple signs indicating ownership or tax obligations. These everyday details, mundane as they seem, were the foundation of the great kingdoms. When the collapse came, it shattered not only palaces, but also the thousands of ordinary lives woven into the palace economy. What makes the Bronze Age collapse particularly haunting is that it did not announce itself loudly. There was no single earthquake, no single invading army, no single drought severe enough on its own to explain the destruction that followed. Instead, the warning signs appeared slowly, perhaps too slowly for those living through it to detect. Somewhere in the highlands of Anatolia, harvest yields dropped just enough to strain local supplies. In a coastal port, a shipment of tin arrived late, delaying the production of tools used for farming and building. In a minor vassal state, a governor complained about increasing bandit raids, but the central palace, stretched thin, could not send enough troops. Nobody could see the full picture. No one realized that several small failures were accumulating like pressure beneath the surface of the earth. What we know today comes from scattered clues. Letters found in the ruins of Ugarit, describing enemies approaching from the sea. Burned foundations of once thriving cities, broken tablets left incomplete, as if the scribes who carved them had fled mid-sentence. Archaeologists sifting through collapsed storerooms found jars still filled with grain that would never be eaten. In some cities, the destruction layers revealed charred beams lying precisely where roofs had fallen. In others, skeletons untouched by looters lay where they died, unburied. One such clue comes from a surviving letter sent by the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus during those last harrowing days. The king of Ugarit pleaded for help, stating that his cities were under attack, his troops were away, and the enemy was overwhelming his land. He wrote that his ships were out at sea, and the attackers had already reached the gates. The letter was never sent. The clay tablet was baked accidentally in the fire that destroyed the palace. It is one of the last messages from a dying kingdom. But at the moment where our story begins, before the collapse truly arrived, life still felt stable. People continued repairing irrigation canals, continued trading goods, continued offering sacrifices to their gods for prosperity and protection. The storms gathering at the edges of the world went mostly unnoticed. Consider, for a moment, the palace administrators who managed the flow of resources. Their world depended on predictability. They recorded crop yields, measured rations, and allocated manpower for projects such as road repairs or temple building. Their calculations assumed that the next year would resemble the previous one, that the supply of bronze would continue, that trade partners would remain stable. In hindsight, this optimism seems naive, but at the time it was simply practical. The entire system of the late Bronze Age relied on trust in continuity. Even the great kings lived inside this illusion. The king of the Hittites exchanged diplomatic letters with leaders in Egypt, addressing one another as brother, a title reserved for monarchs considered equals. These letters spoke of marriage alliances, gifts of precious metals, and occasionally complaints about shipments delayed longer than expected. The tone of these letters reveals a world of political maneuvering, but also a sense of shared stability among the region's powers. No one expected that within a generation, their thrones would crumble to dust. Yet beneath this apparent stability, small stresses accumulated. Evidence suggests that climate shifts began reducing rainfall in some regions, putting pressure on agriculture, increasing mobility among groups on the margins of these empires. People seeking food, land, or safety created tensions along borders. Some scholars believe that internal rebellions grew as palace obligations became heavier during times of shortage. Others point to the reliance on long-distance trade for tin, a fragile lifeline that, once disrupted, crippled the production of bronze tools and weapons. Each of these factors alone might have been manageable. Together, they formed the early tremors of a world on the edge. Still, life continued. Travelers walked dusty roads between fortified towns. Merchants bargained over amphorae of oil or jars of honey. Priests tended to temple fires, and workers repaired walls that had stood for centuries. It was a world full of activity, noise, and motion yet balanced on foundations that were already beginning to crack. One can almost imagine a scribe in the palace of Ugarit, carefully inscribing a letter onto wet clay, never imagining that his city would cease to exist within a few years. Or a Mycenaean bronze worker hammering a blade, unaware that the supply chains feeding his craft would soon collapse. Or a farmer, noticing that his harvest was slightly smaller than usual, assuming it was a temporary inconvenience rather than a sign of approaching turmoil. We begin our journey here, in the quiet before the storm, because understanding the collapse requires understanding the world that existed before it, a world full of human effort, organization, and routine, a world that believed tomorrow would be very much like today. But if a civilization cannot recognize the first cracks forming beneath its feet, how can it know when the ground is about to give way? What overlooked detail, hidden in the ordinary rhythm of daily life, might have been the first sign that everything was about to change? If the final decades before the Bronze Age collapse felt stable on the surface, the truth simmered quietly underneath. The great kingdoms depended on rhythms that had held for generations, rains arriving on time, harvests meeting expectations, trade routes remaining open, vassals staying loyal. Yet the earliest agents of collapse were not armies or invaders, but small environmental changes that seemed trivial at first. A slightly thinner harvest, a shorter flooding season, a few wells running lower than usual. These were not dramatic signs, not the kind that spark panic, but rather the dull inconveniences of life that administrators filed away and promised to solve the following year. Across the eastern Mediterranean, evidence now suggests that rainfall began to decline in several regions, not in abrupt, catastrophic droughts, but in gradual reductions. In places where the land was already dry, this decrease meant that soil hardened sooner, crops wilted earlier, and fields that once produced enough barley or emmer wheat for local consumption suddenly required supplemental grain from palace storerooms. These shortages set off chain reactions. Palaces that relied on predictable tribute from dependent towns received smaller shipments. Storage rooms that had always held surplus grain now carried just enough to get through the winter. The bureaucratic system designed around abundance found itself struggling to accommodate uncertainty. Imagine a small farmer in the foothills of Anatolia during this time. Each year he tilled the same narrow strip of rocky soil, sowed barley, and prayed to the gods for rainfall. When the downpours became less reliable, he adapted. He watered his crops more frequently from wells that reached deeper into the earth. He rationed grain more carefully, stretching his supplies by baking thinner loaves. When his harvest dropped, he gave what he owed to the palace but kept almost nothing for himself. His world did not collapse overnight, it simply became harder, year after year. Drought, in itself, did not topple the Bronze Age world, but it eroded the margins of safety. Palaces relied on surplus. Without it, their ability to redistribute food to workers, soldiers, and dependent communities began to falter. When a palace failed to provide rations, people drifted away seeking food elsewhere, joining bands of migrants along borders or turning to raiding. In the archaeological record, this appears not as a dramatic line of destruction but as subtle changes. Grain silos containing less grain, abandoned outlying farmhouses, shifts in livestock patterns. At the same time, internal stresses grew. Many late Bronze Age economies operated through what scholars call a palace redistribution system. Farmers and artisans owed goods and labor to the palace, and in return the palace supplied food, tools, and protection. When harvests shrank, obligations did not. People still had to meet their quotas, still had to contribute grain, wool, or labor for public works. In times of abundance, this system kept society organized. In times of scarcity, it weighed heavily on those at the bottom. Letters from local officials reveal early signs of strain. Some complain about workers fleeing their obligations. Others request additional troops to deal with bandits. A few warn their superiors that fields have gone fallow or that shipments of grain are arriving late. These warnings are usually polite, occasionally urgent, but rarely panicked. The officials writing them still believed the system would hold. Meanwhile, palace granaries, the backbone of state authority, show signs of change. In several cities, archaeologists have found storerooms that once held vast quantities of grain reduced to much smaller stocks. Some granaries were expanded, indicating attempts to stockpile more in response to shortages. Others were simply abandoned. A few were hastily reorganized, their storage jars rearranged in ways that suggest administrators were trying to stretch resources further, dividing rations into smaller portions. One of the most revealing clues comes from the island of Cyprus, an essential hub in the Bronze Age trade network. Cyprus was a major producer of copper, which, when combined with tin, formed bronze. Without Cyprus, the supply of copper to mainland kingdoms faltered. Archaeological evidence shows that during this period, copper production fluctuated significantly. Some mines appear to have been worked harder than ever, possibly to compensate for shortages elsewhere. Others show signs of abandonment, perhaps because workers had left in search of more stable conditions, or because the palace could no longer organize the labor necessary to keep mining operations running. This instability in copper production rippled outward. Armies required bronze weapons, farmers required bronze tools, artisans required bronze for everything from razors to ceremonial objects. When supplies tightened, priorities shifted. Armies were supplied first, leaving civilian needs unmet. Tools were repaired instead of replaced. Broken items were melted down and recast. In a world so dependent on bronze, even small shortages created tension. Compounding these issues was the fragility of long-distance trade. The Bronze Age economy relied heavily on the movement of goods across seas and deserts. Ships carried not only copper and tin, but also luxury goods, oils, textiles, carved ivory, incense, and precious stones. A palace might depend on a shipment of cedar wood from Lebanon to build a new structure or maintain a fleet. Another might await a delivery of tin from distant lands hundreds of miles away. If even one link in this chain faltered, the effects could cascade. A letter found in the archives of the Hittite capital speaks of merchants delayed by difficulties on the road, a vague phrase that could mean anything from bad weather to hostile groups blocking trade routes. Another letter complains that shipments of essential goods had not arrived in many days, a sign that delays were becoming common. Merchants themselves faced increasing risks. Drought meant fewer pastures for pack animals, making overland travel more difficult. Displaced groups along borders sometimes turned to raiding caravans. Coastal towns, once secure, found themselves strained by resource shortages, making them less able to protect visiting traders. In this climate, even a single ship lost at sea mattered more than usual. Yet, for people living through these changes, life still contained a semblance of normality. Farmers planted crops each year. Potters shaped their jars and fired them in kilns. Scribes sat cross-legged on pallets in palace storerooms, carving letters into clay tablets. Families prepared meals, celebrated festivals, and observed religious rituals as they always had. But beneath these routines, the quiet tension of survival sharpened. Take, for instance, a scribe working in a coastal city. His job might have involved keeping records of grain distribution, tracking which households received rations, and ensuring that workers were supplied during public building projects. As shortages increased, his records would become more complicated. He might update lists more frequently, adjusting rations, noting which shipments arrived late, and documenting complaints from laborers. His tablets would reveal, subtly but clearly, a world losing its predictability. In rural areas, small communities may have felt the changes even more deeply. Without the protection of city walls or palace guards, villagers faced increasing pressure from both environmental challenges and social tensions. If harvests failed, they relied on stored grain or on trade with neighboring communities. If bandits became more active, they had to defend themselves or flee. Such movements of people, often not dramatic enough to be recorded, could eventually contribute to broader instability, as displaced groups placed additional pressure on cities that were already struggling. Some scholars believe that these smaller shifts helped create the conditions for larger migrations that would later be linked to the so-called Sea Peoples. While the exact origins of these groups remain debated, it is likely that many were displaced individuals or communities responding to environmental pressures, resource shortages, or political turmoil. But at this early stage, their movements were small, scattered, and not yet the sweeping force they would later become. The palaces, meanwhile, attempted to adapt. Administrators adjusted ration lists, increased demands on vassal states, and initiated building projects meant to secure food supplies or strengthen defenses. In some regions, governments reorganized land ownership, redistributing fields to ensure that farmland remained productive. In others, officials attempted to impose tighter control over local populations, possibly in response to perceived disorder. These measures were not signs of impending collapse, they were the typical responses of a stressed but functioning system. Yet each adjustment indicated pressure building beneath the surface. Religious rituals also reflected growing anxieties. Temples played crucial roles in ancient societies, not only as houses of worship but as economic centers. Priests oversaw offerings of grain, livestock, and crafted goods, ensuring that the gods remained satisfied. During times of hardship, offerings often increased, not decreased. People turned to the divine for protection and stability. In some temples, evidence suggests that animal sacrifices became more frequent, possibly reflecting attempts to appease gods believed to control rainfall and fertility. These rituals, though solemn and deeply meaningful, also reveal the underlying uncertainty of the age. What makes this period so significant is not that it was marked by dramatic events, but that the slow accumulation of stresses pushed societies toward a tipping point. Stability in the Bronze Age required balance between supply and demand, between environmental conditions and human expectations, between political authority and local compliance. As that balance weakened, so did the foundations of the great kingdoms. And yet, through all of this, people carried on. They repaired tools, tended to livestock, and stored grain in clay jars sealed with mud stoppers. They wrote letters, navigated trade routes, and cared for families. Their resilience allowed the system to endure far longer than one might expect. But resilience has limits, especially when confronted with multiple pressures at once. The question that lingers is simple and haunting. At what point did these gradual, almost invisible changes accumulate into a crisis that could no longer be ignored? The first signs that the world was truly unraveling did not come in the form of warnings or declarations, but in layers of ash. In excavation sites across the eastern Mediterranean, archaeologists have uncovered thick black bands marking the sudden destruction of cities that had stood for centuries. These layers do not lie. It takes only a single night of fire to erase the work of generations. Yet the story behind each burned city is far more complex than the charred beams and collapsed walls suggest. They are the physical record of administrative failures, food shortages, panicked defenses, and desperate efforts to hold on to a world that was slipping away. Take the city of Ugarit, for example, a bustling coastal hub that once echoed with the calls of merchants, the clatter of bronze tools, and the rhythmic scratching of scribes carving letters into clay. Its palaces and warehouses stood close to one another, forming a network of economic activity. But in its final days, the city braced for an attack it could not withstand. The destruction layer reveals a sudden, overwhelming fire. Roof beams fell inward and sealed tablets in place, preserving them accidentally for millennia. The walls split and collapsed. Tools and pottery were left exactly where they fell, as if the people had no time to gather them. Near one of the destroyed storerooms, archaeologists found evidence of jars that still held grain. The grain had carbonized in the heat, turning black, but retaining its shape. It is one thing to imagine a city destroyed. It is another to see food harvested, stored, and meant to sustain life still sitting untouched centuries later, indicating that the disaster struck before anyone could retrieve it. This small detail, simple and dull on the surface, tells a larger story. The administrative system responsible for distributing grain had already failed, and the destruction came before the city had time to regroup or reorganize its supplies. Across the region, similar clues appear in city after city. In the ruins of Mycenaean centers such as Pylos and Tiryns, layers of destruction reveal collapsed palaces and storerooms. At Pylos, the famed Room of the Chariot tablets was found with hundreds of clay tablets that had been hastily dried by fire. These tablets contain lists of troops, references to watchers along the coast, and allocations of bronze weapons. The presence of these last-minute defensive preparations suggests that the Mycenaean rulers knew trouble was coming, but were unable to prevent it. In these tablets, one can trace the quiet panic of an administration trying to muster resources in the face of a threat. Scribes recorded calls for more guards, more supplies, more oversight along the shoreline. They listed damaged equipment, weapons needing repair, and the distribution of armor to soldiers. Yet these preparations seem to have been rushed. Many tablets were incomplete. Some contained errors that scribes normally would have corrected. These details, small, procedural inaccuracies, reveal a world where the ordinary machinery of governance was faltering. The destruction layers in Greece show intense fires, fallen walls, and shattered pottery. Some palaces appear to have been burned intentionally. Whether the attackers were external enemies or internal rebels remains debated. But what is certain is that the palace system, which had directed economic activity for generations, collapsed almost immediately. Without the palaces, there were no central administrators to record rations, no officials to collect grain, no scribes to document trade. Ordinary people were left without the system that had supported them. In parts of Anatolia, the fall of the Hittite Empire left behind ruins marked by both fire and abandonment. The once great capital of Hattusa, nestled in the highlands, shows signs of deliberate evacuation. Walls remained standing, but buildings were left empty. The granaries lacked evidence of fresh storage, suggesting that supplies had already dwindled. Some houses were ransacked. Others were left with items still inside, as if their occupants expected to return, but never did. This mixture of hurried departure and unfinished tasks paints a picture of a city not destroyed in a single violent blow, but weakened over time until it could no longer sustain itself. In the Hittite heartland, smaller towns reveal similar patterns. Some were burned, others were abandoned. But the most telling evidence lies in the abrupt halt of administrative records. In the last surviving tablets, officials complain of shortages, missing shipments, and local unrest. After this, the written record goes silent. The scribes stopped writing, not because they ran out of clay or tools, but because the administrative apparatus itself collapsed. Without the palace system, there was no one left to organize labor, oversee distribution, or enforce order. Look closely at the evidence from these sites, and a pattern emerges. Destruction was often preceded by administrative breakdown. Palaces could not gather resources. Officials could not mobilize defenses. Local communities began to fend for themselves. Some resisted, others fled. The collapse was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow drain of stability that left cities vulnerable when threats finally arrived. In coastal regions, the collapse of maritime networks added to the chaos. Ports that once received shipments of copper, tin, oil, wine, and luxury goods from distant lands found themselves cut off. Without ships arriving regularly, warehouses fell silent. Dock workers who once unloaded cargo and maintained vessels had less work. Naval patrols diminished. As sea-based trade weakened, so did the political influence of coastal rulers who depended on maritime wealth. Some cities attempted to adapt by increasing local production, but this shift strained their limited resources. Without imported goods, artisans were unable to craft items that required materials from far away. Bronze production declined as tin became scarce. Farmers struggled to meet the increased demands placed on them. Local elites tried to hold on to power, but their authority was tied to the broader system that was now failing. The fall of inland cities shows a different pattern. Instead of sudden destruction, some experienced gradual decline. Houses were rebuilt on top of older structures, using simpler materials. Pottery became less refined. Trade goods became scarce. People turned inward, relying on local resources rather than long-distance connections. This shift, subtle at first, grew more pronounced as the collapse spread. Entire regions transitioned from complex palace systems to small, self-sufficient communities. Archaeological layers show changes in diet as well. In cities that eventually collapsed, earlier layers contain varied remains, fish bones from distant shores, imported grains, and spices from far-off lands. Later layers show simpler, more local foods. Sheep and goat bones become more common than cattle bones. Barley replaces wheat in greater quantities. These dietary shifts reflect both environmental pressures and the loss of trade networks. One of the most striking pieces of evidence comes from abandoned workshops. Bronze smithing areas, once active with tools, molds, and furnaces, show signs of hurried abandonment. Some contain tools left mid-production, as if the artisans dropped everything and fled. In other places, furnaces contain the remains of only partially smelted metal, suggesting that supplies had dwindled or that the workshop was no longer functioning smoothly. These abandoned workshops represent more than economic decline. They symbolize the loss of the technological backbone of the Bronze Age world. In many cities, walls built for defense were hastily repaired or reinforced during the final years before destruction. Stones were stacked without the careful planning seen in earlier construction. Mortar was applied unevenly. In some places, temporary wooden palisades were erected where stone walls had once stood strong. These improvised structures reveal a sense of urgency. People were preparing for attacks, but lacked the manpower or resources to build proper fortifications. Inside the cities, signs of social tension grow more visible. Some houses were looted before the final destruction, suggesting internal unrest. Valuable items were hidden in obscure places under floors, inside jars, behind walls, as if their owners feared theft more than open invasion. In a few sites, skeletons were found in unusual positions, sometimes inside houses rather than in burial grounds, indicating that people may have died during sudden violence or upheaval. Despite all this, it is important to remember that many communities attempted to adapt and survive. People continued to farm, trade, and craft goods as best they could. In some places, small groups rebuilt on top of destroyed structures, trying to continue life amid ruins. Their resilience is evident in the layers of rebuilding, however modest those attempts were. But the large-scale systems that once connected these communities were gone. Without the palaces and administrative networks, local efforts could only go so far. The collapse was therefore not simply destruction, it was the end of a way of life. The palace-centered model of economic and political control disintegrated. Literacy declined as scribes lost their positions. Long-distance trade disappeared. New forms of local governance emerged in the aftermath, but they were simpler, more fragmented, and less ambitious. The world that rose from the ruins would be drastically different from the one that preceded it. Yet, even as these cities burned and economies fractured, people must have wondered what was happening beyond their sight. They saw only the destruction around them, but the collapse was widespread, touching regions they had never visited. How many of them realized that the world beyond their own city was falling apart as well? And how many believed that their own misfortunes were isolated, unaware that they were part of a much larger unraveling? Which leads us to a deeper question. When living through the collapse of a familiar world, how much can people truly understand about the scale of the forces reshaping their lives? The slow cracking of the Bronze Age world becomes even more visible when we step into the archives, left behind letters written on clay tablets that somehow endured fire, collapse, and the passing of more than 3,000 years. They are small things, hardly glamorous, rectangular lumps of clay with wedge-shaped impressions pressed into their surface. But inside them live voices, voices that whisper, complain, plead, and sometimes panic. Many were written in palaces that no longer exist, in cities that were abandoned or burned and never rebuilt. And many of these voices describe a world that knew it was coming apart long before the final blow. One such letter comes from a ruler in what is today southern Anatolia, a man whose name Amurapi was etched so firmly into these tablets that we can still read it. In the final days of his city, he wrote to the king of Ugarit, pleading that there were no forces left to defend his land. His grain supplies were exhausted, his ships were gone, his soldiers were scattered, and whoever was arriving by sea, he wrote, was powerful enough to overwhelm everything he had left. For centuries, the people who built these coastal cities had believed the sea was their lifeline. Suddenly, it had become the source of a threat they could not understand. We do not know whether Amurapi's message ever reached its intended reader. The tablet was found in the ruins of a destroyed palace, still unfired, meaning it had not even been fully processed before the end came. It survived only because the fire that consumed the building baked the clay hard enough to preserve it for thousands of years. The fire took the palace. It took the city. But it left the letter behind as a kind of quiet fossil of fear, and when we read it, we can sense the human behind the words, a man who knew he was witnessing the final days of something far larger than himself. Elsewhere in this collapsing world, another set of tablets shows what the ruling elite were worrying about long before any invaders appeared. Many describe shortages so mundane that they almost feel out of place in a story about civilizations crumbling. They talk about delayed shipments of tin, overworked scribes, unfit oxen, and ration lists missing barley. But it is precisely these unexciting details that show us the deeper truth. The system that held the Bronze Age together was so hyper-connected, so delicately balanced, that even small disruptions in daily life began to ripple through it like cracks in old plaster. When the tin caravans stopped arriving, bronze could not be produced. When bronze production halted, tools dulled, weapons broke, and agricultural yields dipped. A field ploughed with an old bronze blade is not ploughed well. A harvest gathered with a chipped sickle is a poor harvest. The importance of these details is easy to overlook today. We live in a world where individual tools are easily replaced, where entire factories can produce replacements overnight. But in the late Bronze Age, a single broken plough could mean a smaller yield for an entire community, and smaller yields meant less grain for soldiers, less bread for workers, less surplus to trade. It created a chain reaction that spread slowly but relentlessly through the entire system. Even before any foreign army arrived, the Bronze Age kingdoms were already struggling to maintain themselves under the weight of these everyday pressures. Across the eastern Mediterranean, similar problems were recorded by the Hittites, who once ruled a massive kingdom stretching from central Anatolia to the edges of northern Syria. They left behind countless administrative tablets, lists, inventories, orders. The bureaucrats who wrote them rarely cared about storytelling. They cared about getting things where they needed to go. And so, buried inside these dry texts, we find a record of food shortages, depleted royal granaries, desperate requests for grain from neighboring states, and entire villages abandoned because the land could no longer sustain their inhabitants. The Hittite kings, once powerful enough to challenge Egypt, were now begging for foreign grain to feed their own people. And then there is the strange case of widespread migrations groups moving across the landscape in search of lands that still had food and security. Some of these groups were small, others were large enough to be noted by multiple kingdoms. But the most significant detail is that many of these migrations appear to have been internal rather than external. People were leaving their ancestral homes, not because they wanted to conquer, but because they could no longer survive there. Climate evidence from this period shows prolonged drought across regions that had once been fertile. Lake levels dropped, rivers shrank, harvests failed repeatedly, livestock died. And when the land itself stops cooperating, societies that rely on predictable cycles begin to tighten, strain, and then crack. Yet even in these conditions, there were moments of human determination that feel almost painfully relatable. In the city of Amar, located along the Euphrates, scribes continued to record marriages, property sales, and contracts for land, even as the political world around them disintegrated. One contract from this period describes a man selling his field simply to afford enough grain to keep his family alive. Another details a local dispute about a boundary line, an argument so petty and ordinary that it almost feels comforting. Even as kingdoms toppled and trade routes vanished, people still cared about whose donkey was grazing on whose land. It reminds us that history's largest catastrophes are always experienced through the small lens of daily life. The Egyptian Empire, far to the south, preserved its own account of these troubles. Ramesses III and his successors wrote inscriptions describing foreign groups arriving by both land and sea, displacing earlier populations and seeking safe territory. But mixed into these dramatic descriptions were quieter notes of strain, crop failures, rising grain prices, and difficulty maintaining Egypt's vast network of dependencies. Tomb inscriptions from ordinary workers reveal wage delays, food shortages, and even a rare labor strike, what may be one of the earliest recorded strikes in human history. These workers were not elite soldiers or noble officials. They carved tombs in the Valley of the Kings, lived in modest homes, and relied on consistent rations to survive. When those rations stopped arriving, they walked out in protest. Their voices, too, became part of the record of a world teetering on the edge. Some regions attempted to adapt with impressive resilience. Small communities shifted toward mixed agriculture, diversifying crops to protect against climate instability. Others abandoned vulnerable lowlands and moved to defensible hilltops, creating new settlements built with simpler architecture and fewer luxuries. Archaeologists have found the remnants of these hilltop villages, stone foundations, handmade pottery, tools repaired instead of replaced. These were not the homes of wealthy merchants or aristocrats. They were the homes of people who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that survival required letting go of the older, fragile way of life. And yet, despite all of these adaptations, the cascade of interlocking failures grew too large for any one society to manage. What makes this era so haunting is not that each kingdom fell in the same way, but that they fell for different reasons that happened to occur simultaneously. Drought weakened some. Political infighting crippled others. Loss of trade shut down economies built on distant imports. Foreign migrants displaced local communities. Invaders struck weakened borders. And beneath it all, regular families simply tried to endure. When archaeologists dig into the layers from this period, they often describe what they see as a destruction horizon, a thin band of ash and shattered debris that sits between two layers of human occupation. One layer belongs to the grand cities of the late Bronze Age. The other layer belongs to the simpler, humbler settlements that came after. That thin line of ash marks the moment when everything changed. In some cities, the destruction is clearly the result of fire. In others, there is evidence of abandonment rather than violence. And in many places, no one knows exactly what happened at all. The cities simply ceased to be. What is striking is how quickly a once connected world became a patchwork of isolated, struggling communities. The trade routes that had carried goods across continents collapsed. The scribal schools that taught advanced writing systems disappeared. Entire languages vanished from use. Metallurgy regressed. Pottery styles became simpler. Political centers splintered. It is not that humans forgot how to create complex societies, but rather that the conditions that supported such complexity no longer existed. And so, in reading the quiet remnants of this time, those small tablets, those grain lists, those desperate letters, we are left with a puzzle that is both historical and deeply human. How does a world that relies on cooperation, communication, and connection respond when the links binding it together suddenly weaken? And what does it feel like, on an ordinary day, in an ordinary household, to realize that the world you grew up in may not be the world your children inherit? Before we move forward, consider this lingering question. If the most delicate threads of our modern world were to fray the same way the Bronze Age networks once did, would we recognize the early signs, or would they be buried beneath the ordinary noise of daily life just as they were thousands of years ago? Before we continue deeper into the unraveling of the late Bronze Age world, let me gently remind you, if you have not yet subscribed to History in Ashes, please consider doing so. This channel survives the same way those ancient kingdoms once did, through support, attention, and a shared belief that preserving the past matters. And just as those empires slowly faded when people stopped contributing grain, bronze, and labor, this channel will quietly wither away if no one taps that little subscribe button. So, help us avoid our own miniature version of a collapse. Now, let us step back into the old world. As the Bronze Age crisis deepened, the great courts of kings, once vibrant centers of diplomacy and ceremony, began to thin. Where delegations had once arrived carrying gifts of gold, fragrant oils, dyed textiles, or carefully carved ivory, there was now silence. The famous Brotherhood system, a diplomatic network connecting Egypt, the Hittites, Babylonia, Assyria, Cyprus, and smaller Levantine states, had relied heavily on constant communication. Kings addressed each other as brothers, exchanged priceless gifts, and discussed everything from marriages to military requests. But in the century leading up to the collapse, these letters began to shift in tone. Earlier correspondence often contained flowery greetings, praising each other as peers chosen by the gods. Later letters feel strangely impatient, almost pleading. One Babylonian king wrote to Egypt, complaining that his last gift had not been reciprocated properly. Another wrote that his merchants had been mistreated at a foreign port. These small diplomatic irritations may seem trivial, but they reveal an international system that was beginning to lose trust. Diplomacy in the late Bronze Age was built on stability. If a king promised to send grain, he needed to send it. If he agreed to support an ally, he needed to follow through. But droughts, shortages, and internal unrest made it harder to fulfill these obligations. And when a kingdom could not deliver, others took note. The system frayed, not because of one betrayal, but because repeated disappointments chipped away at confidence. It is difficult to maintain alliances when everyone feels too weak to help anyone else. The evidence for these shifting relationships is plentiful. The Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt, preserve the correspondence of rulers who could sense that something was worsening but could not fully grasp the scale of the coming disaster. These letters describe ambassadors who waited weeks to meet kings who were suddenly too busy dealing with internal troubles. They describe missed shipments, delayed caravans, and polite excuses that increasingly sounded like desperation. Outside the courtly sphere, ordinary people were navigating their own version of collapse. Farmers, artisans, and laborers, whose work had quietly kept these empires running, began to feel the strain first. One of the clearest signs of widespread stress is found in dietary remains excavated from several settlement layers across the region. Archaeologists have noticed that after centuries of consistent agricultural practices, the types of grains and legumes consumed began to change. Communities diversified their crops, planting varieties that were more drought-resistant but yielded less food. Animal bones tell a similar story. Large livestock such as cattle became rarer. Sheep and goats, more resilient in dry conditions, became more common. Hunting increased too, suggesting that domesticated food sources were failing. A society's diet may seem like a quiet detail, but it is also one of the most reliable indicators of environmental stress. When people begin eating differently, it means the land is no longer cooperating in the ways it once did. In the coastal cities of the Levant, many communities shifted toward maritime survival strategies. Instead of relying solely on imported grain from inland kingdoms, they increased fishing, harvesting shellfish, and gathering local plants. Some towns even expanded their harbors in an attempt to maintain trade networks, hoping that if land routes failed, sea routes might still hold. But the very world they depended on was changing too quickly. Inland kingdoms faced challenges of a different sort. Fortified cities that had stood for centuries suddenly experienced unexpected population pressure. People fleeing failing agricultural lands crowded into these centers, creating shortages and unrest. We find evidence of hastily built walls, rushed construction projects, and crude repairs made to older fortifications, signs that people were bracing for threats they could not fully identify. One remarkable example comes from the site of Hazor. Archaeologists discovered storage areas filled with half-empty jars, charred remains of goods, and workshops abandoned mid-task. It appears the city was caught in a moment of transition, a society trying to adapt quickly, but not quickly enough. Hazor had been a major power during the Bronze Age, mentioned in Egyptian texts as an important vassal kingdom. Its fall reveals the vulnerability of even the most established settlements. Beyond the cities, smaller communities responded with more flexibility. Villages in the highlands of Canaan grew in number during this period, suggesting a quiet demographic shift from large urban centers to modest, self-sufficient settlements. These villagers lived simply. They used handmade pottery, built small stone houses, and practiced mixed agriculture. Their lives may have been more difficult, but they were also less dependent on complex trade networks. In many ways, these humble communities represent a form of resilience. They adapted by stepping away from the grandeur of the late Bronze Age world and embracing survival-focused living. Meanwhile, across the Aegean world, the Mycenaean palaces, those monumental centers with painted frescoes, vast storerooms, and complex administrative systems, began to falter. The tablets written in Linear B show that late in their history, these palaces were struggling with shortages too. Rations were reduced, deliveries became less reliable, and as their overextended systems began to crumble, some palaces suffered catastrophic destruction by fire. Others were abandoned more quietly, as if their people simply walked away. One lingering debate among historians is whether foreign invaders played a major role in these collapses. Egyptian inscriptions speak of groups arriving by sea people, later referred to as the Sea Peoples. But what remains unclear is whether these groups were invaders, migrants, displaced refugees, or some blend of all three. It is entirely possible that they were reacting to the same pressures felt across the region: drought, famine, political instability, and the breakdown of earlier systems. In other words, the so-called Sea Peoples may not have caused the collapse. They may have been another symptom of the same underlying crisis. Even more intriguing is how uneven this collapse was. Some regions fared better than others. Assyria, for example, did not collapse outright. It weakened, retreated, and reorganized, but it endured. Egypt survived, though in a much diminished state. Cyprus also experienced significant destruction, but eventually recovered. This selective survival suggests that the collapse was not a simple wave of destruction, but a complex process shaped by geography, internal politics, environment, and adaptability. At the heart of this story lies the question of what it feels like to live through such a period, not as a king or a general, but as a farmer, merchant, scribe, or craftsperson. Imagine standing in a marketplace once filled with imported goods and seeing fewer items each year. Imagine hearing rumors of nearby villages abandoned, caravans robbed, or ships that never returned. Imagine watching fields produce less harvest with each passing season. Imagine feeling the fabric of your world loosen thread by thread. And yet, amid all this uncertainty, people continued to hope. They repaired tools, rebuilt portions of their homes, and replanted fields, even when the rains failed. They taught their children skills that had been passed down for generations. They carved simple pottery when the ornate styles became too expensive. They adapted because adaptation was the only choice they had. In these small acts, repairing a sickle, storing leftover grain, moving to higher ground, we find the quiet resilience that keeps societies alive, even when larger structures fall. Collapse, after all, is rarely a sudden moment. It is often a gradual process in which ordinary people continue living, adjusting, and enduring long after the great kings have written their last letters. So as we look at this era, one question lingers. If you were living in that world, not as a ruler, but as someone simply trying to survive, at what point would you have realized that the old order would not return, and what small choices would you have made to keep your family safe? When we look closely at the archaeological layers that belong to the final decades of the late Bronze Age, we begin to see something strange, not only destruction, but transformation. This period was not simply an ending. It was a long moment of reshaping, in which older systems became brittle, while new ways of living quietly emerged beneath the surface. And in these layers, we find clues about how people tried to hold their lives together, even as the world around them shifted in unpredictable ways. One of the most revealing sights from this period is the ancient port city of Ugarit. For centuries, Ugarit thrived as a commercial hub, connecting the eastern Mediterranean's major powers. Ships from Cyprus, Egypt, and the Aegean carried copper, timber, wool, and luxury goods to its harbors. Caravans from inland kingdoms brought grain, spices, textiles, and precious metals. The city was wealthy, cosmopolitan, and deeply tied to the systems that defined the Bronze Age. But in the twilight years before its destruction, we see hints of anxiety in the letters and administrative tablets left behind. Officials recorded missing shipments, delayed payments, and grain shortages. Merchants struggled to fulfill their contracts. Palace scribes logged complaints about rising prices, dwindling supplies, and the difficulty of maintaining trade relationships. One tablet, written by a merchant named Rapanu, describes his frustration with port officials who failed to unload a shipment of vital goods. His letter is mundane, almost tedious, as he explains the importance of the cargo and the consequences of the delay. And yet, it is precisely these ordinary frustrations, the kind anyone could relate to, that reveal the deeper truth. The mechanisms that had once kept Ugarit thriving were breaking down one small inconvenience at a time. Empires do not collapse in a single dramatic moment. They collapse in the endless accumulation of small failures that no one has the resources to fix. Meanwhile, inland regions experience their own transformations. In the highlands of Canaan, a new pattern of settlement emerged: small, scattered villages built on defensible hilltops. Archaeologists have found dozens of these sites, typically consisting of stone houses arranged around central courtyards. Their pottery was simple and handmade, their tools were modest. Their architecture lacked the monumental qualities of the cities they replaced. Yet these communities represent a remarkable adaptation. They used terracing to cultivate slopes, practiced mixed farming, and organized themselves into small, kin-based groups rather than relying on large state structures. For decades, historians debated who these highland settlers were. Some associated them with the earliest Israelites. Others saw them as displaced farmers from lowland regions. Still others believed they were pastoralists who became more sedentary during times of stress. Whatever their origins, one thing is clear. Their way of life proved far more resilient than the palace-based economies that preceded them. They required fewer imported materials, relied on local resources, and were less vulnerable to the collapse of long-distance trade. Their settlements survived not because they were powerful, but because they were simple. Further west, on the island of Cyprus, something equally fascinating occurred. Despite suffering destruction in several cities, Cyprus adapted far more successfully than many regions. The island became a major producer of copper, and even in the collapse's aftermath, Cypriot metalwork continued to circulate widely. Researchers have found evidence that Cyprus actually increased some aspects of production after other regions faltered, perhaps taking advantage of diminished competition. Shipwrecks offshore show that even during crisis years, Cypriot merchants were navigating the seas, carrying amphorae filled with oil, wine, and metal ingots. But even this resilience had limits. Some Cypriot workshops reveal rushed or sloppy workmanship, signs of overstretched labor forces. Storage areas once filled with goods were partially empty. Coastal settlements built additional defenses, suggesting they feared raiders or migrating groups. So while Cyprus weathered the storm better than most, it too felt the pressure of a crumbling world. Farther east, Assyria maintained its structure through sheer discipline. Unlike the Hittite or Mycenaean kingdoms, Assyria had a more centralized, militarized society. Its kings controlled food supplies, organized large-scale irrigation, and maintained a strong standing army. These factors helped it endure when others fell. But even Assyria was not immune. In this period, royal inscriptions speak of famine years, rebellious cities, and difficulties maintaining distant territories. The kingdom survived, but it was forced into a quieter period of contraction before eventually rising again in the following centuries. One of the most haunting pieces of evidence from this era is a collection of human remains found in several destroyed cities. In some sites, bodies were discovered in the streets, suggesting a sudden catastrophe that left no time for proper burial. In others, remains were found beneath collapsed buildings, indicating that people were trapped when structures burned or crumbled. Yet these tragic scenes are not uniform. Some cities show evidence of careful burials even during times of turmoil, suggesting that communities still cared deeply for their dead and tried to maintain dignity despite the chaos. Daily life, too, continued in stubborn ways. Pottery workshops kept producing goods, though the quality often declined. Farmers still sowed fields, even when yields dwindled. Artisans repaired old tools rather than crafting new ones. Children learned to read and write in small, local schools, even as the great scribal institutions of earlier centuries faded. In one particularly poignant example, archaeologists discovered a child's writing tablet in a modest home, with practice lines of cuneiform signs etched unevenly across the surface. It seems this child was learning the basics of writing at a time when literacy rates were collapsing across the region. It is a tiny reminder that even in periods of historic turmoil, families continue to teach, hope, and prepare their children for a future they could not predict. As the crisis deepened, one of the most significant changes was the shift in military technology. With bronze becoming harder to produce due to tin shortages, communities increasingly turned to iron. Early iron tools and weapons from this period were often of poor quality, brittle, and inconsistently forged. But over time, blacksmiths learned better techniques, and iron eventually surpassed bronze in strength and availability. This metal transition did not cause the collapse, but it marked a turning point, an adaptation that allowed emerging societies to equip themselves more reliably. Iron became the metal of a new age, one shaped less by grand palaces and more by small, self-sufficient communities. In some regions, collapsed cities were never reoccupied. Their ruins became silent markers of a lost world. In others, new populations moved into the ruins, repurposing old stones to build simpler homes. The archaeological layers in these cities are a patchwork. Beneath lies the sophisticated Bronze Age, with imported goods, detailed records, and monumental temples. Above lies a humbler Iron Age settlement, built by people who lived with fewer luxuries, but often greater independence. These layers show not only loss, but continuity generations, reshaping the landscape according to their needs. One of the most compelling elements of this period is the sense that people were aware, at least in part, that their world was changing irreversibly. The letters preserved in clay, the rushed repairs on city walls, the shift from bronze to iron, the movement to higher ground. These are the behaviors of societies that understood they were living through extraordinary times. They were not passive victims of collapse. They were active participants in adaptation, making choices shaped by fear, resilience, tradition, and necessity. And through all of this, one question echoes from the archaeological record. At what point did people realize that the world their grandparents knew was already gone? And how did they explain these changes to themselves? As we move deeper into the late stages of the Bronze Age unraveling, a quieter truth becomes visible beneath the ashes and broken walls. Collapse did not erase human intention. Even as kingdoms dimmed and cities cracked, people were still making choices, still devising strategies, still shaping their survival with the tools and knowledge they had inherited. What we see in these layers of history is not a sudden plunge into darkness, but a long, uneven negotiation between old expectations and new realities. One of the clearest windows into these negotiations comes from agricultural landscapes across the eastern Mediterranean. When archaeologists examine ancient pollen trapped in lake sediments and soil deposits, they find dramatic shifts during this era. Grains that once dominated, like wheat and barley, appear in smaller concentrations, replaced by hardier plants that required less water. Olive pollen decreases in several regions, suggesting that groves were neglected or abandoned. In some places, grape cultivation persists, which may indicate that wine production remained viable even during periods of strain, perhaps because it required less water than cereal fields. These environmental clues reveal how farmers adapted not by abandoning agriculture entirely, but by altering what they grew in response to a climate that had become unreliable. In many valleys, terracing became more common. Stone-lined platforms were built to slow erosion and preserve moisture, allowing crops to cling to hillsides that would otherwise have been unsuitable. Terracing is tedious, labor-intensive work. It requires patience, planning, and cooperative effort among neighbors. The fact that so many terraced slopes date to this period suggests a communal determination to maintain food production even when the land resisted. People were not simply reacting, they were engineering their survival. The long-distance trade networks, once central to Bronze Age prosperity, had nearly vanished by this time. The caravans that carried tin from distant mountains, the ships that brought copper from Cyprus, the merchants who exchanged luxury goods between kingdoms, these channels fractured and could not be repaired quickly. Yet local trade continued. Small-scale markets emerged in the ruins of former commercial centers. People traded pottery for grain, tools for livestock, cloth for small amounts of metal. This kind of local exchange rarely leaves behind dramatic inscriptions or monumental architecture, but its traces can be found in the distribution of everyday objects. Handmade vessels found dozens of miles from their point of origin, hint at ongoing contacts between neighboring communities. Interestingly, the collapse of long-distance trade also led to a revival of older, localized craft traditions. For centuries, Bronze Age elites had preferred imported goods, Aegean pottery, Egyptian jewelry, Mesopotamian textiles. Local artisans often imitated foreign styles, sometimes successfully, sometimes awkwardly. But when imports dwindled, communities turned inward. Regional pottery styles re-emerged in distinct forms. Some were simple, with plain surfaces and practical shapes. Others revived decorative traditions that had been overshadowed by foreign influence. Even in decline, culture did not stand still. It adapted, sometimes subtly, sometimes boldly. In certain areas, new forms of leadership arose to fill the void left by faltering palace governments. Where kings once ruled through scribes and bureaucrats, authority began shifting toward local councils or kin-based groups. A village elder, a lineage head, or a local warrior might hold more influence than a distant monarch who no longer had the power to enforce laws or collect tribute. Archaeologists identify this shift through architecture. Instead of grand palaces, we find larger domestic structures surrounded by smaller homes. These may represent communal gathering places or the residences of emerging local leaders who operated with far simpler authority than the rulers of previous centuries. This decentralization had consequences, both positive and negative. On the one hand, communities became more self-sufficient. They relied less on fragile trade networks and bureaucratic systems. They made decisions that directly reflected local needs rather than imperial interests. On the other hand, the loss of centralized authority sometimes led to conflicts over land, water sources, and grazing rights. Without strong oversight, disputes that once might have been resolved through diplomatic channels could escalate into local confrontations. Yet, even these conflicts show us something important. People continued to fight for their homes, their fields, their herds, meaning they had not yet given up on their world. Societies do not struggle unless they still believe in the possibility of a future. In some regions, religious practices shifted as well. Temples that once held immense wealth, gold vessels, imported incense, elaborately decorated altars were abandoned or fell into disrepair. But local places of worship persisted. Simple open-air shrines, stone altars, and small sacred enclosures became more common. Objects used for household rituals increased in number. This suggests that as centralized religious institutions weakened, spirituality moved closer to home. Families and small groups performed rituals that had previously been conducted by priestly elites. Faith did not disappear. It became more personal, less ceremonial, and more intertwined with daily survival. Written language also underwent a profound transformation during this era. Complex scripts like Linear B and the cuneiform systems used by palace scribes declined sharply. Literacy had always been tied to administration and state control, so when those systems dissolved, writing became less common. However, simplistic or alphabetic scripts began to spread. These writing systems required fewer signs, less training, and could be learned by a broader segment of the population. It is no coincidence that the earliest forms of alphabetic writing in the Levant appear around this time. In a landscape where complexity was fading, simplicity gained power. The seeds of future written traditions were being planted, even as older scribal cultures dimmed. Meanwhile, the Mediterranean coastline tells a story of shifting populations. The remains of temporary camps, crude shelters, and mixed pottery styles indicate that groups were on the move. Some were displaced farmers looking for arable land. Others were small bands of seafarers searching for safe harbors. Still others, like the groups later labeled as Sea Peoples in Egyptian records, were likely a mixture of migrants, mercenaries, refugees, and families seeking stability. Their presence did not necessarily represent vast invading armies. but rather the movement of people whose homes had become uninhabitable. One of the most striking pieces of evidence for this mobility comes from shipwreck remains found off the coast of southern Anatolia. These wrecks contain a patchwork of items: Cypriot copper ingots, Canaanite jars, Mycenaean pottery, and small personal belongings from various cultural backgrounds. This suggests that people of different origins traveled together, blending skills, goods, and traditions. They were not united under a single identity, but bound by shared uncertainty. And in this atmosphere of movement and adaptation, new cultural blends emerged. Pottery styles mixed, metalworking techniques spread, religious symbols traveled between communities. The early foundations of future cultures, from the emerging Israelites in the highlands to the Phoenicians on the coast, from the reorganizing Assyrians to the rising peoples of the Aegean, were shaped in this crucible of migration and transformation. What is perhaps most compelling about this era is that even in the midst of instability, creativity did not cease. People experimented with new agricultural methods. They forged early iron tools. They built terraces, simple shrines, and sturdy hilltop homes. They learned to navigate a world without the protection of great kings. They adjusted their rituals, their diets, their leadership structures, their technologies. They were not merely surviving, they were redefining what life could look like. And so, we are left with a lingering question as we examine the layers of this period. When a world changes so slowly that each generation feels only part of the transformation, how do people understand the shift? Do they think the old ways will return? Or do they quietly build something new without fully realizing that they are laying the foundations of the next age? The inland valleys of Anatolia have always been places of slow change. The hills rise in long, patient folds, shaped less by human ambition and more by the stubbornness of weather and stone. Yet during the late Bronze Age, even these quiet interior lands began to tremble under pressures no one fully understood. The Hittite Empire, once an unquestioned giant, had reached a point where almost every survival strategy required compromise. Grain shipments from the south were arriving later each season. Caravan masters complained of bandits on roads that had been safe for generations, and the palace scribes in Hattusa wrote increasingly anxious reports about missing vassal kings who had not sent offerings in several harvests. In the archives, we find a letter from a Hittite queen, written in a careful, tired hand, begging for grain shipments from the ruler of a faraway land. She wrote that her people were starving, that fields were dry as bone, and that the stores in the royal granaries were almost empty. For an empire that had once fed armies measured in the tens of thousands, such a letter is astonishing. Yet it reveals something essential. The Bronze Age collapse was not just a story of battles and burned cities. It was also a story of dwindling supplies, frayed relationships, and the quiet, grinding anxiety of leaders who realized that the world they knew was slipping beyond repair. The Hittites had depended for centuries on a delicate equilibrium. Their empire was large but not centralized in the way later empires would be. They relied on a web of treaties, distant governors, and carefully negotiated trade corridors. Those corridors wound through mountain passes, connected river valleys, and linked their capital to copper mines, tin routes, and coastal merchants. When any of these fragile links failed, the entire structure of the empire began to wobble. And around the late 13th century before Christ, too many links failed at once. Climate researchers today suggest a long, severe drought spread across much of this region, drying lakes and weakening harvests year after year. Some pollen records indicate a sudden shift toward more drought-tolerant plants. It was not a single terrible year, but a slow tightening of conditions, each harvest slightly worse than the last, each winter slightly harsher, each storehouse slightly emptier. For ordinary farmers, this meant fewer cattle, thinning grain fields, and the constant fear that the rains might not come at all. For an empire, it meant shrinking tax revenues, declining food reserves for armies, and growing resentment among vassals who could no longer meet their obligations. Diplomats tried to manage this unraveling with polite letters written on baked clay. Administrators tried to stretch what they had with ration records that became increasingly strict. Soldiers were dispatched to restore order on trade routes, but even this became difficult as the empire struggled to supply its own troops. In some tablets we read complaints from military officers who said they had not been fed properly in weeks. It is an overlooked truth of history that grand political collapses often begin with small, mundane shortages like missing bread and unpaid rations. Meanwhile, the world beyond the Hittite borders was becoming restless. Towns along the Mediterranean coast were already dealing with piracy, with displaced groups seeking new lands, and with the uncertainty of failing harvests. Alliances that had once been reliable began to crumble as each kingdom looked inward, prioritizing survival over cooperation. Some vassal states that had long accepted Hittite oversight began to drift away, not because of rebellion, but because the empire no longer had the strength to enforce its authority. Distance, which had once been bridged by trade and communication, became a barrier once again. Inside the capital, the great stone walls of Hattusa still stood firm, but the energy that had built them was fading. Scribes continued to record legal disputes, marriages, land transfers, and routine ceremonies, as though trying to maintain the illusion that the world remained stable. Yet even these documents show subtle signs of strain. Land disputes increased, suggesting that productive farmland was shrinking. Religious festivals continued, but the offerings became smaller, almost symbolic. When an empire begins to falter, the rituals often outlive the resources that once gave them meaning. Archaeological remains tell us that the final decades of the Hittite Empire were not defined by a single, overwhelming invasion. Instead, they appear to have been a drawn-out period of weakness. Eventually, foreign groups did move in, some likely connected to the mysterious Sea Peoples. Others, perhaps displaced neighbors seeking opportunity. But by the time these pressures reached the Hittite heartland, the empire had already been hollowed out from within. The collapse was less a dramatic toppling than a slow, inevitable sinking. One of the most revealing discoveries from Hattusa is a set of half-finished buildings abandoned during construction. The stones are neatly cut, placed in partial rows, then suddenly stop. There are no signs of battle, no fire damage, no destruction layer. It appears that the workers simply stopped coming, perhaps reassigned elsewhere, perhaps leaving the city altogether in search of food. A civilization can endure war, famine, or mismanagement for a time, but when people quietly begin to walk away, the end becomes unavoidable. There is also evidence that the royal family attempted desperate measures to maintain stability. Some treaties from this period hint at concessions made to vassals that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. Others show attempts to reinvigorate trade routes by offering generous privileges to merchants willing to risk dangerous roads. These were the strategies of a leadership trying to buy time, hoping that the climate might shift or that trade might stabilize. But the drought did not ease, and the trade routes did not revive. In the end, Hattusa was abandoned. The once carefully tended royal archives were left behind. The palace complex fell silent, and the empire that had once rivaled Egypt and Babylon vanished so completely that classical writers barely remembered it existed. For nearly 2,000 years, the Hittites were lost to history, buried under soil and forgotten myths. Only in the late 19th century of our era did excavations reveal the full scope of their civilization. Stunning scholars who had assumed the Bronze Age world was far smaller and simpler than it truly was. Standing among the ruins today, one can see wild grasses growing between the stones, the outlines of palaces fading into the landscape, and the empty spaces where thousands once lived. It is a place where silence carries the memory of a world that tried, with extraordinary effort, to hold itself together in the face of forces it could not fully understand. But perhaps the most haunting question is not why the empire fell, but how its people experienced those final, uncertain years. What conversations took place in the markets as grain prices rose? What worries were whispered in households when the rains failed again and again? And at what moment did ordinary families realize that the empire they had depended on for generations could no longer protect them? So we must wonder, in those last days of Hattusa, when the fields were barren and the clay tablets carried only pleas for grain and uncertain promises, did anyone realize they were living through the final breaths of their civilization? Along the narrow coastlines of the eastern Mediterranean, life during the late Bronze Age was built on a delicate rhythm of sea winds, merchant timetables, and the steady pulse of ships entering and leaving crowded harbors. These were the lands where the Phoenician cities would one day rise to greatness. But during the final centuries of the Bronze Age, they were something different. Modest but thriving towns that lived and died by trade. Timber flowed from the mountains inland, olive oil from the terraced hillsides, copper from Cyprus, and luxury goods from Egypt and the Hittite world. Harbors like Byblos and Sidon were woven into a commercial network that had functioned smoothly for centuries until the collapse began sending tremors through the system. At first, the changes were subtle. Merchants returning from Egypt complained that officials were slower to respond, that warehouse supervisors seemed preoccupied, that the usual paperwork had become strangely disorganized. Sailors returning from Cyprus told of villages abandoned near the copper mines and of broken wagons left along the inland tracks with no sign of their owners. From the north came quiet rumors of trouble in the Hittite lands, stories that seemed unbelievable at first. Empires of that size did not simply weaken over the course of a few seasons, and yet one trader after another arrived with fragments of similar newsgrain shortages, road bandits, caravans delayed for weeks. These coastal towns depended on consistency. A missed shipment meant not only short-term hardship, but the unraveling of long-standing agreements. The cargo lists recorded on wooden tablets began to show patterns that worried the clerks. Fewer imports of tin, smaller quantities of luxury goods, and a rising dependency on whatever local resources they could pull from their limited landscape. With less copper arriving, bronze production faltered, and with fewer bronze tools, construction projects slowed. Workshops that had been loud with hammers and furnace heat fell quiet, their workers turning instead to repairing old tools and stretching supplies as far as possible. Life for ordinary people changed in ways that felt subtle at first, but became impossible to ignore. Fishmongers found themselves competing fiercely for dwindling catches as the coastal waters shifted unpredictably, likely a result of climate disruptions. Farmers on the hillsides noticed that the pattern of seasonal rains was behaving strangely, sometimes arriving too late or not at all. Some harvests came in so weak that families rationed their olives, pressing every last drop of oil with a sense of unease that settled into daily conversation. Clay tablets from this era speak of price fluctuations that lasted for seasons on end, leaving many households in perpetual uncertainty. But perhaps the most unsettling change was the increasing appearance of unfamiliar ships on the horizon. At first, these vessels were described as ordinary merchant craft, weathered hulls, patched sails, crews who kept to themselves. Later reports, however, describe ships that arrived without signaling their presence, watched the coastline quietly, and then slipped away. Fishermen who ventured too far saw raiders boarding isolated boats. Villages along exposed stretches of coastline began to experience sudden, violent encounters, with groups who left no clear identity behind, only burned homes, stolen goods, and the unmistakable message that the seas were no longer as safe as they had been for generations. Administrators attempted to respond. In several port towns, they reorganized local militias, assigning rotations to guard watchtowers and fortifying narrow entrances to harbors. But trained soldiers were scarce. Many of the warriors who might have been stationed there had been called away by distant overlords, still trying to hold their territories together. As regional powers weakened, these coastal cities found themselves increasingly responsible for their own survival. And with fewer resources, even these defense efforts grew strained. Amid all this, there were still moments of normalcy. Markets continued to operate, with vendors calling out prices, children weaving between stalls, and fishermen mending their nets, as they had done for centuries. Ships continued to arrive, though, in smaller numbers, with crews exchanging news of distant lands. But beneath this surface calm lay a deepening sense that the world was narrowing. People became quieter when discussing foreign events. They avoided eye contact when talking about missing caravans or abandoned farms. Even the temple rituals showed signs of shift, as offerings became smaller and priests performed ceremonies with an earnestness bordering on desperation, hoping to restore balance to a world that seemed increasingly unstable. Archaeology gives us only fragments of this atmosphere. Charred remains of small seaside settlements hint at sudden destruction. Storage jars show residues of food supplies that were stretched thin. At certain sites, layers of hurried construction, makeshift walls, hastily repaired structures suggest communities trying to buy time. And yet, even in crisis, people adapted with remarkable creativity. Some turned to local crafts, producing goods once imported from afar. Others rebuilt trade networks on a smaller scale, relying on neighbor communities rather than distant empires. This resilience, though often overlooked, played a crucial role in the survival of certain cities that would later rise to prominence. Still, the growing number of displaced groups moving across the Mediterranean introduced new pressures. Ships carrying families pushed from their homelands by famine or conflict began appearing along the coast. Some sought refuge and were welcomed cautiously. Others arrived as raiders, driven to violence by desperation. The distinction between trader, migrant, and invader grew increasingly blurred. Each new arrival carried fragments of stories of burned cities, of collapsing kingdoms, of leaders who had vanished. These stories, repeated from port to port, created an atmosphere of dread, despite the lack of clear information. One of the most telling indicators of this era is the change in burial practices. In several coastal areas, archaeologists have discovered sudden shifts in how the dead were laid to rest, suggesting that traditional customs were disrupted, perhaps because families were displaced, or because communities were too overwhelmed to conduct proper ceremonies. Such changes, though seemingly small, reveal deep cultural stress. When a society begins to lose the ability to honor its dead, it is often a sign that its foundations are weakening in ways daily life cannot fully conceal. Even with all this pressure, some cities managed to maintain a fragile balance. Their harbor leaders focused on diplomacy, offering hospitality to passing ships and forming temporary alliances with nearby communities. Others invested in shipbuilding, creating faster vessels that could evade raiders and maintain essential trade routes. But these efforts required a level of coordination that became harder to sustain as resources continued to stretch thin. And with each passing year, the gap between what these cities needed and what they could realistically accomplish grew wider. In the end, the coastal towns of the late Bronze Age were caught between worlds too dependent on long-distance trade to survive alone, but increasingly unable to rely on the large kingdoms that once anchored their economy. Their resilience ensured that some would endure long enough to influence the Iron Age that followed. Yet many others vanished quietly, erased not by a single catastrophe, but by the accumulated weight of countless small disruptions. And so we must ask ourselves, for the families who watched unfamiliar sails appear offshore, who listened to distant rumors of collapsing empires, and who saw trade decline season by season, did they sense that they stood at the edge of an age ending, or did it feel like nothing more than another year of hardship in a world that had always demanded resilience? In the interior of the Levant, away from the coastlines and bustling ports, the late Bronze Age collapse produced a very different set of pressures. ones shaped by geography, water, and survival in a changing climate. The highland valleys and terraced hillsides tell a story of adaptation, migration, and quiet endurance. As the great kingdoms faltered and trade routes dried up, smaller communities found themselves forced to confront an increasingly hostile environment with ingenuity and patience. Archaeological evidence shows that settlements began to shift from fertile lowlands to more defensible hilltops. Where previously communities had clustered around rivers and plains, people now chose locations that offered natural protection from both human and environmental threats. Stone houses were constructed in tight clusters, often with shared walls to conserve resources. Small courtyards provided space for planting vegetables and herbs, while terraces on the surrounding slopes maximized arable land. These changes were not monumental, they were practical and careful adjustments, reflecting a population that understood survival depended on subtle, incremental choices rather than grand gestures. The diet of these highland communities changed in response to shrinking water supplies and erratic rainfall. Archaeologists analyzing food remains note a shift from predominantly wheat and barley to more drought-resistant grains like millet. Legumes continued to be cultivated, but yields were smaller, suggesting that families had to ration carefully and manage seeds over multiple seasons. Livestock patterns also changed. Cattle became less common in some regions, replaced by goats and sheep, animals better suited to sparse pastures and steep hillsides. This transition illustrates a larger principle. People adapted to environmental stress by choosing sustainable options, even if it meant giving up the luxuries of their ancestors. Water management became central to survival. Small cisterns, channels, and terraces were dug and maintained with painstaking effort. These technologies were not new, they had existed in earlier Bronze Age societies, but during this period, they became crucial. Communities that invested in water retention and soil conservation were better able to endure consecutive years of drought. Those that neglected such measures often vanished, leaving behind ruins and charred debris that archaeologists now study as evidence of failure. Trade did not disappear entirely, even in these highland villages, but it became more localized. Rather than relying on imported tin or luxury items from Egypt, communities traded essential items such as surplus grain, olive oil, pottery, and small amounts of metalwork. These networks were fragile, dependent on personal trust and kinship rather than formal treaties or royal oversight. If a caravan was lost to bandits, or a neighboring village experienced its own shortages, the ripple effects could be severe. But these networks also offered resilience, creating webs of mutual support that did not require the immense scale of Bronze Age empires to function. The social structures in these villages also evolved. With the decline of central authority, leadership often shifted to elder councils or heads of prominent families. Decisions were made collectively, emphasizing cooperation rather than top-down command. This contrasts sharply with the palaces and courts of the earlier era, where kings or governors dictated terms. The decentralization allowed communities to respond quickly to local crises, to allocate resources according to immediate need, and to maintain internal cohesion, even as the broader political landscape fractured. One particularly revealing aspect of this period is the way people memorialized their dead. Burial practices shifted from elaborate tombs to simpler, often communal cemeteries near the villages. Grave goods were minimal, typically functional items such as pottery vessels, simple jewelry, or tools. These modest burials suggest a society that retained spiritual awareness and respect for ancestors, even while it could no longer afford the grandeur of the previous age. They also indicate a form of continuity. People remained attached to their land, to their family groups, and to the rituals that defined their identity, even in times of scarcity. Craft and technology evolved as well. Metalworking continued, though at a smaller scale and with simpler tools. Bronze became increasingly scarce due to interrupted trade for tin, leading many communities to experiment with early iron or to recycle existing bronze. Pottery shifted from intricate imported designs to practical, locally produced forms. These changes were not merely economic, they reflected a cultural adaptation, a reimagining of everyday life in a world with fewer resources and more uncertainty. Even the organization of labor shifted. Large construction projects associated with palaces and temples were no longer feasible. Instead, communal labor focused on projects essential to survival: repairing terraces, maintaining irrigation systems, building simple fortifications, and constructing storage for food and water. The scale may have been smaller, but the effort was no less deliberate, and the benefits directly ensured survival. In these acts, the ordinary people of the highlands became architects of resilience, shaping a world in which they could endure despite the collapse around them. Interestingly, the archaeological record also shows evidence of temporary migration and mobility. Families sometimes moved seasonally to access grazing lands or water sources, and some groups relocated entirely in search of better farmland. These movements were often short-term and adaptive, contrasting with the dramatic invasions recorded along the coasts. They reflect a mindset focused on practical survival, not conquest. Mobility became a strategy, a quiet response to the environmental and political instability that defined the era. Religious practices, like those in the coastal towns, became more personal and localized. Small shrines appear within households or nearby in communal spaces, emphasizing daily observance over elaborate ceremonial offerings. Deities associated with fertility, rain, and harvest were central, reflecting the intimate connection between human survival and the rhythms of the natural world. Religion, in this sense, was a tool for understanding and influencing the immediate environment, rather than a state-controlled institution concerned with diplomacy and prestige. Throughout these transformations, the human capacity for adaptation is evident. While Bronze Age palaces burned and kings vanished, ordinary villagers learned to live with scarcity, to cooperate, to innovate, and to manage the environment in ways that ensured continuity. The collapse, therefore, was not total annihilation. It was a complex reshaping in which survival depended on flexibility, foresight, and an intimate understanding of the local landscape. And so, we are left with a question that resonates deeply. When the foundations of civilization shift beneath your feet, how do ordinary people perceive the change? Do they see the collapse as an ending, or do they recognize it as a necessary transformation, a quiet opportunity to rebuild life in a more sustainable, grounded way? As the late Bronze Age finally gave way to what we now call the early Iron Age, the remnants of once great civilizations dotted the landscape like faint shadows of a vanished era. Cities that had teemed with traders, scribes, and soldiers were gone. Their walls crumbled, their palaces charred, and their archives scattered or lost. Yet life did not vanish along with them. Across the eastern Mediterranean, Anatolia, the Levant, Cyprus, and the Aegean, communities struggled, adapted, and endured. The collapse was not a single dramatic event, but a long, complex transition that reshaped the human world in ways both visible and subtle. In the interior of Anatolia, small settlements repurposed stones from abandoned Hittite palaces, building homes and fortifications suitable for modest populations. Farmers relied on terraces, cisterns, and smaller, drought-tolerant crops to feed themselves. They raised sheep and goats where cattle had once grazed. Villagers engaged in barter with neighboring communities, creating localized economies that replaced the vast, interconnected trade networks of the Bronze Age. Even in the ruins of empire, human ingenuity and adaptability endured. On the coastal cities, the story was one of survival and reinvention. Ports once dominated by foreign fleets and long-distance traders shifted focus to regional commerce. Smaller ships carried essential goods rather than luxuries, and the once powerful influence of distant kingdoms waned. Some coastal settlements were abandoned, while others persisted by embracing flexibility, offering shelter to displaced families, fortifying harbors against raiders, and sustaining local markets despite the loss of imperial protection. These adaptations ensured that civilization did not vanish completely, but emerged in a quieter, less centralized form. In the Aegean, the Mycenaean palaces had fallen, their walls blackened and stores emptied. The people who had once lived in these monumental centers either migrated to smaller villages, took up maritime livelihoods, or joined other communities in the process of rebuilding. Even in destruction, cultural continuity persisted. Pottery styles evolved, but retained echoes of previous artistry. Metalworking continued, shifting toward early iron and recycled bronze, and religious practices endured, even in more modest forms. The stories of kings were gone, but the lives of ordinary people carried forward lessons of resilience, adaptation, and communal survival. Meanwhile, inland communities in the Levant embraced simplicity and sustainability. The hilltop villages, once small refuges, became central to the region's recovery. Terraced fields, carefully managed water systems, and collective labor allowed these communities to endure environmental stress and social upheaval. Leadership shifted from kings and governors to local elders and councils. Trade was modest and localized, but it functioned efficiently, ensuring access to the essentials of daily life. Religion became personal. Tools were repaired instead of replaced, and every decision where to plant, when to move livestock, how to protect stores, was a step in the quiet art of survival. Iron gradually replaced bronze as the primary material for tools and weapons, not by decree but through necessity. Early iron was brittle, inconsistent, and difficult to work, yet it represented a key technological adaptation. With limited access to tin, people experimented, learned, and improved, laying the foundation for a new era. The tools and weapons forged during this period may have been imperfect, but they were sufficient to equip communities navigating a transformed world. Iron became the metal of resilience, a symbol of adaptability when the old networks of supply and power could no longer be trusted. Migration and mobility defined human experience in these decades. Families moved seasonally or permanently in search of water, pasture, and arable land. Displaced populations integrated into existing communities or formed new settlements. Across the seas, displaced groups sometimes arrived as refugees, sometimes as raiders, but always as humans, seeking stability. This movement brought new ideas, techniques, and cultural blending, which became essential in shaping the diverse societies of the early Iron Age. From these movements emerged the early identities of peoples who would define the next centuries, including the Phoenicians, Israelites, and other groups that inherited and transformed the legacies of the collapsed empires. Yet the human experience of this transition was more intimate than the grand sweep of history. Families endured famine years, repaired their tools and homes, and taught their children skills necessary for survival. Markets were smaller but persistent. Children learned to read and write in the modest schools that replaced palace scribal institutions. People adapted religious practices to suit their changing circumstances, honoring ancestors and deities with small offerings at household shrines. Even in the shadow of monumental collapse, daily life continued, full of small acts of resilience that rarely appear in history books, but shaped the world to come. The late Bronze Age collapse ultimately teaches us that civilization is neither a single moment nor a simple structure. It is a collection of human actions, choices, and adaptations. Kings and palaces may fall, trade networks may fracture, and cities may burn, but life continues in smaller, often quieter ways. Humanity survives by bending to circumstances, by learning to work with the land, by relying on local networks, and by preserving the knowledge and rituals that sustain daily life. As we look across the ruined cities, empty harbors, terraced hills, and abandoned palaces, one question remains. When entire civilizations vanish before our eyes, how much is truly lost, and how much persists quietly in the choices, skills, and resilience of ordinary people, shaping a new world from the ashes of the old? The Bronze Age collapse is a story not only of endings, but of human endurance. Empires may fall, but survival, adaptation, and the quiet determination to live continue, reminding us that history is not only the story of rulers and armies, but of the people who rebuild, sustain, and carry knowledge forward when the grand structures fail.